So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to TI Talks live sessions. It's been an exciting week so far because we had very interesting panel discussions and presentations that happened right here on our booth in the past few days. And I believe we are almost ready to start with a new, very interesting presentation. I am Ambra Stocco, Marketing Manager for TagLeaf in Europe, and I will be hosting today's session. So before we start, I would like to invite you to take a seat or grab a spot where you feel more comfortable while we are listening to our speaker. A few things. So after the presentation, I would like to invite you to have a look at our redesign showcase, which is right in the middle of our booth. And there you will be able to see a lot of very interesting examples of success stories where TagLeaf, together with our partners, have supported the switch from traditional to more sustainable packaging solutions. We also have another very nice corner on the outer side of our booth, which is called Dynamic Cyclers Corner, where you will see two Peloton bikes. So the aim of that area is to cycle as much as we can, because TagLeaf will make a donation to Turkish association that will help people affected by the recent earthquake. So after this presentation, we'd like to let you know that there will be a networking session, so please feel free to stay and to network with our speaker or with our TI experts. I would also like to tell you that when Emiliano finishes his presentation, there will be a few minutes for a Q&A session. So whenever you have questions, just feel free to raise your hand and ask the question. So I think that's it for our reminders today, and I will now introduce you the speaker. So welcome, Emiliano, and thank you for joining us today. So Emiliano joined ICIS as senior analyst in 2021. He's the author of the polypropylene short-term price forecast in Europe and the global coordinator of the ICIS supply and demand database on polypropylene. He's a regular speaker at ICIS conferences and webinars, and a key contributor to single client engagements and consulting projects. Before joining ICIS, he worked for more than 8 years in the petrochemical industry, managing diverse industrial projects on polypropylene production and product development. He has evaluated and managed energy injection molding and mechanical recycling projects with the industry. Emiliano is a chemical engineer and MBA. He holds a diploma in integrated project evaluation and a petrochemical industry specialization degree. So, to discuss about the future of polyolefins, please welcome Emiliano Basualto.
Well, can you hear me well, right? Okay, thank you, Ambra, for the introduction, and thank you, everyone, for being here. In this presentation, I will go through two main topics. First of all, the global supply and demand outlook for polyolefins. It comprises polyethylene and polypropylene. And secondly, I will go through what's happening in China in terms of new capacities, especially on polypropylene, which is one of the hottest topics nowadays in the industry. Well, getting into the first topic, first of all, let's have a look at the supply and demand trend for polyolefins between 2019 and 2030. The red line represents the annual average growth, whereas the blue bars represents the cumulative polyolefins demand. It is remarkable the ups and downs of the average growth, of the annual growth, between 2020 and 2022. This can be explained by the very well-known major disruptions globally, or black swan events, such as the COVID-19 outbreak, the logistic crisis afterwards, the cost of living crisis, and of course the war in Ukraine In the long term, we can see here how there is a downward trend in terms of annual growth. And that trend can be explained by some major global trends, such as a global population growth slowdown, sustainability and circular economy affecting especially polyethylene and single-use by end-use applications. And also, the plastic per capita consumption has reached a maturity point in some key countries that in the past drove the demand. I'm talking about countries like China, Mexico, or Brazil. In consequence, ICIS expects a combined polypropylene and polyethylene demand KGR of around 3.7% over the 2022-2030 period, which is a bit lower than the historical trend in the past. Now, here we can see what was our forecast or demand forecast in 2019 before all of those major disruptions, and what is the current forecast for polyolefins demand. The difference between the two forecasts is about 10 million tons, which is around the complete polyethylene and polypropylene consumption in Africa and Middle East together. And also, now let's see how the global demand is distributed globally. Of course, Northeast Asia has the largest consumption share, with more than 41% of the global demand. This is followed by Europe and Southeast Asia. Regarding the long term, Southeast Asia is expected to drive the global demand growth of polyolefins because of countries with large populations, developing economies such as India, Indonesia, or Vietnam. And also it is worth mentioning that we expect that Southeast Asia to surpass Europe as the second largest polyolefin consumer this year. And additionally, Africa is said to have the second largest demand KGR over 2022 and 2030, mainly due to its demographic growth expectations. Now, let's have a look at the end-use demand of polyethylene and polypropylene by application, or broken down by applications. For polyethylene, the total combined demand in 2022 was around 114 million tons. The largest category was packaging film and sheet, which is mainly related to food packaging, industrial packaging, and so on. As for polypropylene, the demand in 2022 was about 85 million tons. The largest category by far was injection molding category, which is related to applications such as household items, vehicles, of course, homeware, and so on. And this is very interesting. This is a chart showing the global plant utilization rates. This is part of the past and the outlook from ICIS. Polyolefin installed capacities have grown and are set to keep growing in the coming years. Many projects were planned and secured financing before 2019, before all those major disruptions, while global demand since that year suffered a dramatic downward correction. Therefore, between 2019 and 2023, the global polyolefins utilization rates are expected to drop by 8%. And we forecast that 2019 utilization rates won't be reached again until at least 2035. But what about the new capacities? Let's have a closer look at the new capacities. Almost 15 million tons of new polyolefin capacities are due to start up this year. 15 million tons. 15 million tons is the polypropylene consumption in Europe, just to have an idea, including Turkey. And over the 2022-2027 period, the global installed capacity is set to grow by 26%, whereas the global demand is expected to grow only by 22%. As we can see on this chart, the stacked red bar belongs to polypropylene, and the polypropylene new capacities stand out, followed by HDPE new capacities over this period. Now, regionally speaking, let's see how the global new capacities will be distributed. The new capacities will be mainly deployed in Northeast Asia. The share of new capacities over this period would be in Northeast Asia will be around 50% of the total new capacities. This is mainly driven by China, followed by Southeast Asia with a share of new capacity of around 20%, and also some new capacities in North America and in Europe. Middle East as well has 2.4 million expected of new polypropylene capacities, but the case of Northeast Asia, especially China, on polypropylene is remarkable. Now, linked to this issue of new capacities, especially in China, we will have a closer look at what's happening in China in terms of new capacities and what are our expectations in terms of the domestic demand in China. I will put a focus on polypropylene here later on because polypropylene is the most remarkable case. But first of all, let's see what's the role of China in the global polyolefins demand landscape. China in 2006 became the largest polyolefin consumer in the world. And nowadays, China accounts for around 37% of the total global consumption of polyolefins. And it is expected to remain at the same share, more or less, in the long term. On a side note, the US is the current second largest polyolefin consumer, and we are expecting that India will surpass the US by 2013, by 2031, if not earlier. Now, and this is like a zoom in to the polyethylene and polypropylene incremental capacities in China over the 2022 and 2027 period. Despite some new HDPE and LLDPE capacities, the dark blue and light blue bars, the case of polypropylene is remarkable, especially for 2023. The installed capacity growth in China is so significant that more than 50% of global new capacities will be deployed in China over this period. And most of new capacities in China, of polypropylene new capacities in China, will be integrated facilities with PDH units upstream. And the PDH units will be fed by imported propane. But what about the installed capacity and the domestic consumption in China? Despite some polyethylene new capacities installed, the polyethylene deficit remained constant, as we can see on the red bar on the chart. This is the installed capacity minus the domestic consumption. For the case of polypropylene, in 2021, the installed capacity in China surpassed the domestic consumption. And this excess of capacity will grow until 2024. This is the green bar on the chart. But it doesn't mean that China became a polypropylene net exporter in 2021. But of course, it had impacted on the global trade flows, as we will see in the next slides. But this slide and the next one will be focused on what's happening in the Chinese polypropylene industry, since, as we saw before, this is the market where more things are happening now. We previously saw that there is an apparent overcapacity in China since 2021, but despite this, China is still the largest polypropylene importer in the world. And given this theoretical overcapacity, we may tend to think that okay, China may become a net polypropylene net exporter shortly, and China may flood all the markets with polypropylene, but that is not very likely to happen, according to our analysis, because of mainly 4 factors. First of all, China still has to develop expertise in more advanced polypropylene products, such as polypropylene copolymers, some polypropylene copolymers, PP compounds for the car industry, some food grades, and some high-performance injection grades. Secondly, the main export market for China is Southeast Asia. But this region is also trying to reduce its deficit, with around 12 million tons of new capacities expected in that region by 2030. Thirdly, there are some logistic disadvantages towards some attractive markets with large polypropylene deficits, such as Europe and Africa. In those markets, for instance, Middle Eastern producers have a logistic advantage compared with China. And in the case of Latin America, which is also another market with a huge deficit, for Chinese producers will be hard to compete with North American producers because the US also has a large oversupply of polypropylene. And finally, and maybe the most important factor, is the cost disadvantage compared against the largest polypropylene exporter globally, which is the Middle East, especially from a feedstock standpoint. As I mentioned before, most of new capacities in China are integrated facilities with PDH units fed by propane, imported propane. Whereas in the Middle East, they have the cheapest raw material in the world, let's say. So in case of a global overcapacity or a global oversupply, in case of a price war, of course, China will be more limited than Middle Eastern producers in case the prices just plummet. But of course, this landscape or this outlook for China is shifting the trading patterns in Northeast Asia. Northeast Asia includes South Korea, Japan, China, and Taiwan. South Korea and Japan are also main actors in the polyolefins industry, especially for some special products or more advanced products such as PP copolymers, PP compounds, and so on. But after this analysis, let's see the expected trade patterns for Northeast Asia. This chart represents the interregional trade of Northeast Asia, including actual and forecast data. It is clear in the chart if we see the red bar that Southeast Asia is the pivotal region for Northeast Asian trade patterns. And as I mentioned before, the reduction in the Southeast Asian deficit will constrain China's export and therefore Northeast Asia export. That's why we are expecting that only over the 2021 and 2024 period, the region will be a net exporting region. After that year, the Northeast Asia region will come back to be a net importing region. In sum, or summing up, new capacity in China have changed the region's status now, but this status relies on the deficit in Southeast Asia. And hence, this new status won't last forever according to the current polypropylene outlook. And well, thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to take questions about those topics or some other ones, or to have a further discussion later on.
Thank you very much, Emiliano. I would like to ask the audience if there is anyone who would like to ask any questions.
Go ahead.
You talked about the added capacity in China on the polypropylene, and you also talked about the PDH units supplying them and importing the propane. Where is that propane going to come from? Do you know? Is that from North America, Middle East?
Actually, it will come from everywhere, and from everywhere. I mean, the propane is a very mature and liquid market. I don't have the details of what are the contracts behind the new projects, but it could come from everywhere.
Anyone else?
Can you comment on how you think the change in oil flows and the Russian-Ukraine situation might have some ramifications on the marketplace?
Yes, of course. Well, that's a very good question, and the answer depends on the market we are looking at. I will talk about Europe in this case. Before the war, well, let's start with the very basics. The main cost driver for polyolefins is the feedstock, ethylene or propylene. And in Europe, most of the olefins are produced from naphtha, by cracking the naphtha. And before the war, around 40% of the naphtha came from Russia. The European naphtha came from Russia. So we have, of course, an upward pressure on feedstock prices given that situation. And this is something very specific for Europe. So if we, for instance, follow, we were discussing this this morning. If we follow the crude oil prices and the naphtha price in Europe, we will see a slight decoupled given this logistic reason. So, of course, given the war in Ukraine and the sanctions on Russia from the European countries, Europe will face maybe the most difficult scenario in terms of cost structure and margins of producers.
Any other question? I actually have two pre-submitted ones. So the first one is, how strong is the link between crude oil and the price of polymer?
Okay, well, related to the previous question, it's very strong. It's very strong. The crude oil prices practically drive all the downstream materials. I mean, naphtha, propylene, ethylene. So the link is very strong. However, there can be some major events that disrupt this link, like the war in Ukraine and the sanctions on Russia. But it is expected that the trend of crude oil prices will drive the future naphtha prices and therefore the propylene prices and subsequently the polyolefin prices.
Thank you. The second one is, how do you see the recycling developments in the polyolefin industry?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Regarding recycling, we have to understand the two worlds of the recycling industry. We have on the one hand the chemical recycling. The chemical recycling is expected to impact the polyolefins industry, but upstream. I mean, even though the industry is still in early stage of development, we can expect in the future to have more naphtha coming from chemical recycling. And the naphtha should compete with the conventional naphtha, and therefore there will be more availability of feedstock for propylene, ethylene, and therefore polyethylene and polypropylene. But the chemical recycling shouldn't affect the end-use demand of polyolefins because it is more like an upstream development. And the mechanical recycling, well, first of all, in terms of technology, the mechanical recycling is much more developed, but the constraints of the industry is at the sorting and collection levels. The recycling penetration in most countries is still very low. In Europe, it's around 6%, 7%. This is the mechanical recycling production over the real demand on a country level. But we can expect, of course, that there will be further developments. There will be a higher penetration in the market from mechanical recycling, but that shouldn't affect the total demand of the market. Because, again, that will imply that there will be more availability of product in the future, but it may come at a cost. So that's why, for instance, we can see nowadays how the recycling materials are even more expensive than virgin materials, because, of course, there are also many companies and many institutions pledging to use a certain amount of recycling materials, but the industry is not prepared to supply all the volumes needed by the industry nowadays.
Thank you very much, Emiliano. Thank you for sharing your insights. And so if there is no other question from the audience, I would like to invite you to stay also after the presentation to network with the speaker or with our TI experts. And thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining.
Thank you.